you, Pascali. Yes, I would have thought when opening this to say that, kind of like Alexander, my paper would be a slight outlier in regards to the theme of the conference, in that I'm perhaps approaching this from a slightly different perspective, in that not looking straight at the receptions in Hellenistic polis or the interaction with traditions in Hellenistic polis, but kind of taking a sort of different angle on it and looking at engagement between kings and Athenian institutions. But I have kind of altered it slightly based on some of the discussions we had yesterday, and I've decided to kind of talk a little bit more within the body of the paper about ideology as well, and particularly these terms freedom and democracy that I had initially planned to stay away from, but decided to give a bit more rein to based on discussions after Nino and Manuela's papers, but also some of the ideas have appeared also in what Ben was presenting to us earlier. The handout for this, I'm going to share screen. The handout for this is voluminous, but the idea here is to present kind of the broad scope of what I hope to do with this as a written version of the paper, which is to take a sort of case study for royal engagement with the institutions of Athens in the Hellenistic period, from Philip II down to Philip V. Remains to be seen whether that's going to be too much, actually, for the scope of a paper. I may end up having to break it into a couple of publications. But so the handout includes pretty much a sense of the entirety of that material. So it might be useful for individuals and for attendees for their own interests. But what I'm going to do for the purposes of this paper is to look at one example of this. I chose to look at Demetrius in Athens in the year 303, because I thought this shows some of the more interesting interaction between a monarch and both the institutions, but also the ideology of early Hellenistic Athens. So looking at interaction with the demos, but also looking at interaction with the ideas and the concepts so closely associated with them. In this instance, democracy and freedom, but also more generally the idea of independence of action and authority. Another reason why I chose this specific example is that it's quite neatly integrates both literary and epigraphic sources, and we have a wealth of material for this. So this specific example will kind of focalize a discussion a little bit of some themes that will appear both in the chronologically earlier and chronologically later material when I'll write this up as a printed version. So Polybius records that at a meeting of the Achaean assembly in the early 180s, the ambassadors of Eumenes of Pergamon renewed their alliance with the League and offered it a gift of money. The Achaean politician Apollonides of Sicyon urged the Achaeans to reject the money, since it was not offered in good faith. It was really a bribe. And to accept it would place the League in Eumenes' debt. Soon all the kings would be offering the League money. What a problem. And he continued, quote, "As the interests of democracies and kings are naturally opposed, it is evident that one or the other thing will happen. Either the interests of the kings will take precedence over our own, or we shall appear to everyone to be ungrateful in acting against our paymasters." Athens was the democratic state par excellence, and its importance as a figurehead of the Greek world was recognized by the kings of Macedon. The city's Persian war heritage led Philip to treat it with kid gloves after the Battle of Chaeronea, while Alexander was careful to keep Athens on side during the first years of his Asian campaigns. Similarly, when one of Antigonus Monophthalmus's courtiers advised him to garrison and hold Athens as a gangway, Epivatra, into Greece, as Antipater and Cassander had done before him, Antigonus refused and proclaimed that Eunoia would be a surer gangway, and that Athens, as a watchtower of the Ecumeni, would shine his glory amongst men. The implication here is obviously the restoration of freedom and democracy under Demetrius. The anecdote is oft quoted, but it reveals the different ways in which Alexander's successors dealt with Athens, to conquer and garrison or to honor and liberate. And it shows Macedonian recognition of the importance of Athenian political and cultural heritage in the Hellenistic world. But were the interests of kings and cities so naturally opposed? Could monarchy secure, defend, or even promote democracy? Antigonus's program of liberation, the great burst in the rhetoric and reality of grants of freedom and autonomy under his reign from 315 to 301, was, alongside Alexander's declaration of 334, emphasized by Manuela yesterday, one of the defining moments in establishing the principles of freedom and democracy as key components in the relationship between kings and cities. Athens, its cultural heritage and its deep connection with the terms Eleftheria and Demokratia was at the absolute heart of this. So the published version of this paper will look at royal engagement or interference with Athenian institutions from Philip II to Philip V. However, for the purposes of the presentation today, I'll limit myself to discussing the evidence for Demetrius Poliorketes' interaction with the institutions and ideology of democratic Athens in the first half of the year 303, a very contextualized case study, but fortunately a very rich one. I'll discuss three events from the year 303. The Maiden affair of early spring, perhaps March, April, Demetrius' initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries in May, and his request for honors for a number of associates later that year in June. I will use this material to examine the interaction between royal power and democratic institutions, but also to trace the engagement between the king and Athenian democratic ideology, namely contestation over the terms Eleftheria and Demokratia. The example of Demetrius in Athens will serve as a focal point then for a wider consideration of the features of royal interest in and engagement with Athenian democratic institutions. And I'll make a few comments more widely on the Hellenistic world, kind of building on discussions from yesterday and today. One point I'd like to propose is that what we see in Athens' engagement with Demetrius at this time is contestation between different understandings of the relationship between monarchic ruler and free democratic ruled city, between what we might term, and these are very poor titles, an Athenian model that privileges the independence of democratic institutions and ideology above royal power, and a royal or perhaps Hellenistic model that argues for the importance of these terms and ideals, but requires them to adapt and bend themselves to royal authority. Can we see in Athens at this time the great convergence happening in reverse, with the Athenians' understanding of Eleftheria and Demokratia being influenced by other traditions from throughout the Aegean world? Okay, so let's move on to the first part, to talk about the Maiden affair. Demetrius arrived at Athens on Trigalion, the 11th month of the year, Trigalion 26th, 307 BC, during the festival of the Plinteria. He liberated Athens, razed Cassander's garrison on Munichia, expelled Demetrius of Phaleron, and allowed the city to govern itself again as a democracy. The Athenians undertook extensive political reforms that also honored their Macedonian liberator. 2 new tribes were added, named Antigonus and Demetrius, meaning that the Vuli was expanded to 600 members. The monument of the 12 eponymous heroes was extended to accommodate 2 new statues. The secretary cycle was restored, and 2 new sacred triremes were also commissioned, the Antigonus and the Demetrius. There's no evidence that these political reforms were imposed by royal will. Rather, they were civic reforms, efficiently repurposed as royal honors, and they can be paralleled elsewhere, as we'll see later. Demetrius left Athens in spring 306 and did not return until summer 304, after which Plutarch records increasingly tense interactions with Athens' democratic institutions, culminating, in Plutarch's account, in Demetrius' extraordinary initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries in May 303. Demetrius' return in summer 304 saw immediate victories. Euboea was captured, the siege of Athens, Cassander's siege of Athens was lifted, while alliance was also made with the Boeotians. The winter of 304-3 was spent in Athens, perhaps the occasion for some of his debaucheries on the Acropolis, before Demetrius left in February 303 to begin his Peloponnesian campaign. By June, almost the entire Peloponnese, north of Messenia and Laconia, had been brought under his control. Demetrius' star could not have burned brighter, but Plutarch now records a series of diplomatic missteps that jeopardized much of the goodwill that Demetrius had won in Athens. Plutarch likely, I think, overestimates the unpopularity of Demetrius' actions, but in both the Maiden affair and Demetrius' initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, we have clear evidence for Athens' democratic institutions bending to royal will, a dangerous precedent that for Plutarch showed the hollowness of the freedom and democracy that Demetrius had brought. Plutarch describes the Maiden affair of March-April 303 as a turning point in Athens' relations with Demetrius and the first clear instance where royal will is seen to triumph over the wishes and authority of the Athenian democratic institutions. And we have the account of it as number 32 on the handout. Plutarch records that an Athenian citizen named Cleomedon owed the city 50 talents, but that his son, Cleonidas, persuaded Demetrius, currently campaigning in the Peloponnese, to send letters to the demos on his behalf requesting remittance of the fine. Although unhappy with the situation, the Demos obliged. It then debated and passed a decree that henceforth no Athenian citizen was to bring before it letters from the king. When informed of this, Demetrius was incensed. The Demos hurriedly recanted the decree, executed some of those who proposed and supported it, and exiled others. A new decree was drafted by Stratocles of the Omea and passed by the Ecclesia, stating that, quote, whatever King Demetrius should ordain would be holy for the gods and just for men. Athens had been in this situation before, when the Athenian dramatist Athenodorus had been fined for reneging on his promise to appear at the Dionysia, perhaps in 324, and had asked Alexander to write to the Demos on his behalf. However, in that instance, Alexander had handled the situation better, and instead of writing to the Athenians as Athenodorus requested, he simply paid the fine himself. And I think the interesting point here is we find an Athenian citizen bringing the king into the state and asking the king directly to overrule the authority of the institutions. But the king hesitates. Thus the fine was paid, and Athens' judicial authority remained intact. However, not only did Demetrius undermine the Athenian judiciary, he also cost the state 50 talents. The Cleomedan affair betrays Athens' poor understanding of the importance of Athens' institutional independence. His letter requesting the absolution of Cleomedan's debt may have prioritized royal will over civic autonomy, but Athens and Demetrius' responses in turn each worsens the situation. By refusing to accept any further letters from the king, the Demos placed the independence of its institutions and judiciary over royal will. Demetrius, in his turn, privileged royal authority over civic autonomy. Both parties acted unilaterally without consideration of the other's authority through either the civic decree or the royal letter. Plutarch's account of the Cleomedan affair also provides insight into Athens' assertion of its own authority at this time. Plutarch distinguishes between the proposal of the decree not to accept Demetrius's, here we are in bold, in italics. Plutarch distinguishes between the proposal of the decree not to accept Demetrius's letters, egrefe de psephisma, and the Demos' enactment of Stratocles' decree, accepting whatever Demetrius orders as holy for the gods and just for men. Pro psephisanto, didocte to demo ton Athenaion. Plutarch's choice of terminology is precise. Firstly, the docte to demo ton Athenaion, used to describe Stratocles' decree, reflects the language used to describe the resolution clause of Athenian decrees. And it shows that this decree was passed and enacted. Second, by describing the decree not to accept Demetrius' letters as a psephisma, to psephisma kathilon, Plutarch is saying that it was passed, but was rescinded before it could be enacted or published on stone. And we have some other examples of this terminology appearing later. Yes, also other passages in Plutarch, number 40 to 42. So by contrasting the repeal of the first decree with the enactment of the second, Plutarch paints a vivid picture of a dysfunctional Athenian institutions buckling under the pressure of royal authority and internal political debates. He reveals that although the Demos was unwilling to stand up for itself or enact its own decrees, it was willing to accept Demetrius' letters, even though they undermined the independence of its political institutions. He's also contrasting the ineffective democratic faction of Demochares and others with the more effective democratic and pro-Antigonid faction of Stratocles. The Demos lacked the resolve to publish a decree protecting its authority, but it was servile or sensible, actually, perhaps a more accurate way of presenting it. It was sensible enough to recognize the necessity to bow to royal wishes and accept Demetrius' orders as binding. So to move on to the second point, the Eleusinian mysteries. Dating to Munichion, 10th month of the year, 3043, shortly after the Cleomedan affair, Demetrius' exceptional initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries shows how he showcased the new institutional authority of his letters to demand modification of the traditional functioning of Athenian religious institutions. Well, traditions, I suppose, rather than institutions. Demetrius' initiation has been much commented on, but it has traditionally been misstated, as both Plutarch and Diodorus place it in spring 302, though epigraphic evidence has shown conclusively that his initiation took place in early 303. The consequences of this redating have been explored by our panel chair, by Thomas Rose, and also by Pat Wheatley, but Demetrius' irregular initiation needs to be contextualized a bit more closely within his increasingly fraught relationship with Athens and its democratic institutions in the year 3043. Pascalis himself has made important remarks on this in his 2008 book, and I am indebted to that for what follows. Plutarch, number 43a, preserves the fullest account of Demetrius' initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. While campaigning in the Peloponnese in spring 303, Demetrius wrote a letter to the Athenians requesting initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. However, by the time of his request, Munichion was the 10th month of the year, he was too late for initiation into the lesser mysteries, which took place in Anthesterion, the 8th month. The fudge designed by Stratocles was to rename Munichion Anthesterion, to allow Demetrius to complete the lesser mysteries, then rename the month Boedromion in order to allow him to complete the greater mysteries and the full initiation, the Apoptia, which was usually scheduled for at least a year afterwards, before finally changing the month back to Munichion again and continuing with the regular year. Both Plutarch and Diodorus has a brief account of it in 43b, place Demetrius' initiation in their accounts of the events of the year 302, but an inscription recording honors for one Maiden, an associate of Demetrius and dating to the 9th day of Anthesterion Hysteros, 3043, was recognized by A.G. Woodhead as evidence for Stratocles' calendrical reforms taking place in Munichion 303 rather than 302. We'll come back to this inscription later. Demetrius' letters to the Demos and his extraordinary initiation have been recognized since the late 4th century as symptoms of the hollowness of the freedom and democracy that Demetrius brought. What independence does the Demos actually have if its laws, decrees, institutions, and sacred rites must bend to the king's will? What is the authority of the civic decree if it can be nullified by a royal letter? The narrative, while undoubtedly accurate, is somewhat simplistic, and there is a danger, I feel, of putting too much weight on the opposition that Plutarch attributes to Philippides, Demochares, and Pythagoras. 3 anecdotes, really. Pascalis has highlighted opposition to Demetrius in Athens in the year 3043, completely correctly, but this does not negate the fact that Demetrius was still, for others in the city, immensely popular. His arrival in autumn 304 immediately ended Cassander's siege of Athens in the 4 Years' War. Boeotia, Euboea, Attica were under Demetrius' control or allied with him by winter. And in spring 303, his lightning campaign into the Peloponnese saw the quick liberation of Sicyon, Corinth, Bura, Skyros, Orchomenos, Argos, Troezen, and other states, bringing all of the Peloponnese, save Messenia and Laconia, to Demetrius' side. The campaigns were represented in both literary and epigraphic sources as victories on behalf of freedom and democracy, and Demetrius' associates were honored in these months for their work defending these ideals. 45a gives you an account of Demetrius' associates being honored in Athens for defending freedom and democracy in the years 307 to 301. The evidence here is voluminous, but it's perhaps worthy to specify one instance, the inscription ISE 7, which is number 46 here, Decree of the Select Volunteers. I'll give you the translation. This is an inscription from 303 published by a group of Athenian volunteer troops serving with Demetrius in the Peloponnese, and they describe Demetrius as the Great, as having, incidentally, is the first reference, I think, of someone being described as the Great in the Greek world, a Greek, as having expelled the enemies of democracy, freed the land of the Athenians and the other Greeks, before describing the Peloponnesian campaign as being undertaken on behalf of, quote, common freedom and salvation, and calling on the Greeks to erect altars and make sacrifices to Demetrius Soter. Remarkably, the inscription also records that they chose to erect an equestrian statue of the king in the Agora next to the statue of Demokratia, and fragments of this statue have been found and show it to have been gilded. So, in spring 303, just as the literary sources describe Demetrius' impositions on Athens' institutions and independence as being their worst, the epigraphic evidence offers a different perspective and reveals his exaltation as a restorer of Greek freedom and defender of Athenian democracy. The epigraphic evidence undoubtedly preserves echoes of the royal narrative, the way that Demetrius, his associates, and his supporters in Athens wished him to be seen, but we cannot simply dismiss it out of hand. It is, of course, suspicious that such a narrative appears in the epigraphic evidence at precisely the moment that the literary sources document Demetrius' increasing unpopularity and his worst impositions on Athens' institutions. But the coincidence reveals another layer to the contestation over his influence on the Athenian state, outlined by Plutarch through the quips of Philippides, Demochares, and Pythagoras. Demetrius' demands during the Cleomedon affair, his requests for honors for his associates, and his wish to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries all undermined the independence and authority of Athens' institutions. But the epigraphy shows the counter-argument and reveals just how forcefully his supporters claimed that military victories safeguarded Athens' freedom and democracy. The honorary inscription, the honorary decree for the otherwise unknown Maiden, the honorary decree for the otherwise unknown Maiden, an associate of Demetrius, shows how this was achieved, as it records that during the month Anthesterion Hysteros, while Stratocles' calendrical reorganizations were in full swing, and while Demetrius was being initiated into the lesser mysteries, Maiden was sent to Athens by the king to announce the return of certain forts to the control of the demos. As Paschalis and as others have argued, these are most likely Philae, Oropos, and Panacton, which Demetrius had captured from Cassander and his brother Cleistarchus in 304. Interestingly, the forts that Demetrius returns, Philae, Oropos, and Panacton, were captured in late 304, before the winter, and so would have remained under royal control for as much as 6 months before Demetrius returned them to the demos in order to ease his initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. Indeed, the return of these forts may have been what Diodorus had in mind when he claimed, quote, Demetrius persuaded the demos to repay him for his benefactions by altering the way things were traditionally done. The forts, as Thomas Rose has pointed out in his recent historical commentary on Plutarch's life of Demetrius, had been kept as leverage by the king, deliberately so. Now, with their restoration to Athenian control, Demetrius countered the argument that his demand for irregular initiation into the mysteries undermined Athenian democracy by showing that his victories and Athens' close relationship with him actually strengthened the demos. They ensured the return of the forts, the defense of the countryside, the grain collection, and with that, the democracy and the Athenian democratic institutions themselves. That Maiden was himself honored for acting on behalf of the salvation, soteria, and the eleftheria of the Greeks. Excuse me. This is lines 15 to 20. Reveals further how careful both the king and his Athenian supporters were to define royal action in terms of civic values. The second of our two examples, to move on to our next point, the second of our two examples of Demetrius using letters when dealing with the Athenian demos consists of a series of honorary decrees for Demetrius' associates passed after the receipt of letters of recommendation from him. And this is number 47 on our handout. This is one example of 4 texts. In 2 instances, the decrees describe the content of the letters, which apparently made reference to eleftheria and demokratia. These terms promote ideals of unity and cohesion between city and king, and their presence within these decrees shows us how the king defined his relationship with the city. Royal letters detailing an individual's actions and requesting honors are not uncommon, and the letters that Demetrius sent on the last day of the last month of the Athenian year, Scirophorion, requesting honors for his associates Sotimos and Eupolis, can be paralleled with earlier examples, such as Polyperchon's letter of the 10th Britanni, the year 3198, requesting citizenship for 2 of his associates, Sonikos and Euclis. Later, in the late 270s, Antiochus I wrote to the city of Ilion requesting honors for his doctor, Metrodorus, a citizen who had recently healed the king of a neck wound. In neither case, however, do we have evidence for how the request was received or debated within the city. Plutarch's account of the Cleomedon affair allows us to read Demetrius' letters, as cited within these Athenian decrees, with an awareness of the political and ideological environment that inspired them, and the conflict caused by the receipt of royal letters, and their engagement with democratic institutions. 4 extant honorary decrees were passed on the last day of the year 3043, Britanni 1229, Scirophorion 1230th. 2 preserve exactly the same text and refer to letters of Demetrius regarding his philoi, Eupolis and Sotimos. I've quoted the example from Sotimos here, but the text is identical in 2 squared 486 in honor of Eupolis. 1 preserves a different text concerning one Bienor, and that's SEG 1658, and another preserves only the dating formulae, so may or may not have referenced the letter by Demetrius. Each of the decrees was proposed, surprise, surprise, by Stratocles. The date of the letters, Scirophorion 304-3, is only a short time after the Cleomedon affair, a few months earlier. And we can see these letters perhaps as a conscious attempt by Demetrius to display and enforce the terms of the decree recently passed regarding the institutional weight of his letters. Indeed, Stratocles' reference to an account of Demetrius' letters in the text of each of these decrees emphasizes the authority of those letters over the city's institutions. The decree for Sotimos of Cyrene is worth quoting. Quote, Stratocles, son of Euthydemus of Diomea, proposed, in relation to what the king sent to the Vuli and the Demos, declaring that he, Sotimos, is his friend, well disposed to the king's affairs and the Eleftheria of the Athenian people, and that he too is an ally in the fight for Demokratia. And since the Vuli has deliberated in his favor and proposed to the assembly, with good fortune, Ketelipa. Freedom and democracy are taken from the civic sphere and appropriated to the royal. Now the king and his friends are the guardians and supporters of Athenian freedom and democracy, not the demos. The democratic city has lost the ability to protect its freedom because the king has assumed fully the role of its guarantor and protector. Demetrius's letters perform royal power over civic institutions, but that power is made palatable by representing the king as a protector of democracy, not a threat to the city's institutions and ideals. Even Demetrius's associates, Sotimos is called a synagonistis, so the relationship extends beyond the king. Through the dispatch of letters, now all but legally binding, Demetrius dictates to Athens the preservation, or the terms of preservation, of its own freedom and democracy. The royal appropriation of these terms appears continually in Athenian inscriptions from the year 307 to 306, where, you have them here, where 14 of the 17 Athenian decrees from the reign of Demetrius Poliorcetes that refer to Eleftheria and or Demokratia concern either Demetrius or his philoi. Only 3 refer to things that refer to the city honoring individuals who are not members of the royal court, let's say. Athenian democratic institutions must submit to a royal will that proclaims itself to be the defense of those very democratic institutions. The letters on behalf of Sotimus and Eupolis show that Demetrius was concerned with engaging with the institutions of Athenian democracy, as is suggested by the fact that the letters were sent to both the Vuli and the Demos, and the decrees in their honor were provolumatic. This important fact suggests concern on Demetrius's part for ensuring that a semblance of democratic procedure was followed when submitting to his wishes. He may well have been advised on this by Stratocles. As Peter Rhodes has shown, an active Vuli was an essential feature of Athenian democracy. The number of provolumatic and non-provolumatic decrees is relatively close, between 4032 and 3232. So the fact that non-provolumatic decrees heavily outweigh provolumatic decrees during the regime of Demades and Phocion has been taken by Graham Oliver as a marker of that regime's oligarchic character. Demetrius's concern with writing to the Vuli and the Demos, when he could just have relied on Stratocles to propose these motions, highlights his careful consideration for democratic procedure at this time, but also the performance of his authority over those institutions. The maintenance of democratic institutions and procedures continues under the king's authority. So, for a conclusion, to bring this together and to expand the image a little bit, what are the big questions here? I'll explore in more detail in the expanded published version of this paper each of the following points, but for the present it's germane to note that the evidence for Demetrius in Athens in spring 303 offers examples for the practical ways in which Macedonian rulers after Alexander secured influence in Athens. Antipater ruled through Demades and Phocion, to whom Macedonian support was given through the garrison in Piraeus. That material is collected in section B on the handout. Cassander similarly ruled through Demetrius of Phaleron, again with the support of a Macedonian garrison in Piraeus. Material gathered under section D, in the handout. In both instances, however, besides the eruptive order to change the constitution made by Antipater and Cassander, there is little to no evidence for these rulers engaging directly with the institutions of the Athenian state. What happens with Poliorcetes is something new, although the core of it is there a little bit earlier with Polyperchon. The king is ready, willing, and able to interfere directly with the institutions of the state. Demetrius would do the same again in spring 295 when he returned to Athens for a second time, oversaw new elections, altering the calendar, and performatively returning to the demos its democracy. We might ask why some rulers directly and personally interfered with the state's institutions and why others did not. Proximity, I think, seems to be important. Antipater and Cassander were concerned with capturing Athens, but thereafter were based in Macedon and left the running of the state to friendly, trusted Athenian politicians, whom they established and supported with the Macedonian military garrison. Polyperchon in 318 and Demetrius in 304 to 302, and also in 2954, were both, however, based in mainland Greece. Athens has even been called Demetrius's capital in these years, and drew much popular support from their self-proclaimed roles as liberators of the Greeks, and of Athens in particular. Again, recognition of Athens as the watchtower of the Ikoumeni and the Epivatra of Greece. Paradoxically, perhaps, the more visible the hard power, the more explicitly direct the royal interference, in Demetrius's case, the presence of the ruler in the city, the dispatch of letters, the request for institutions to act in a certain way, the more concerned the ruler was with legitimizing that power through the rhetoric and ideology of freedom and democracy. When based in Macedon, rulers such as Antipater, Cassander, and indeed Antigonus Gonatas, and I would include here too Demetrius himself, after he gained control of Macedon in 294. They're less concerned with interfering directly with Athenian institutions, though some of that can be seen under Gonatas, and they certainly show little to no evidence of representing themselves as defenders of Athenian freedom and democracy. One might ask whether, paradoxically, royal grants of democracy actually undermine the grant of democracy itself, undermine the very grant they make, a process that newly restored democratic regimes seem quite willing to pull the king into. Demetrius restored Athens' democracy, so the honors that he received were commensurate with the benefaction. Those honors were religious